Fred, are you starting to let folks in now?
Yes.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm seeing our numbers going up, so we'll give it a couple more minutes just to make sure everybody has joined, and then we'll get started. So thank you again for being here. All right, Sheldon, I think we'll go ahead and get started now. All right, greetings, and thank you for joining us today for this very important discussion about the Indian Child Welfare Act state laws. My name is Leanne Murphy, and I'm a senior advisor in the Administration for Children and Families, and we're thrilled to be hosting this webinar in collaboration with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, alongside some incredible panelists from the states that have passed ICWA laws. Today's webinar will focus on the progress that has been made in states that have passed ICWA laws. We have a fantastic lineup of panelists who will be sharing their experiences and insights on how these laws have impacted their communities and the lives of Native American children and families. I want to extend a special thank you to our panelists and our esteemed moderator, Mr. Sheldon Spotted Elk. For today's webinar, we'll start off with some opening remarks from our Commissioner for the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families, Rebecca Jones-Gaston, and then we'll hand it over to our moderator, Sheldon, to move through the conversation. So again, thank you so much for being here. I'll hand it over to Christina from the National Council for Juvenile, Family, and Court Judges. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you. My name is Christina Andrews. I am a site manager with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. I am Hiachara O'odham, which are the Sand people. I am a member of the O'odham Nation. These are tribes in the southwest of the United States from the Sonoran Desert. I want to thank the participants for being here today. And before we begin the presentation, I want to introduce Ms. Rebecca Jones-Gaston. Ms. Gaston is the Commissioner of the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families at the Administration for Children and Families within the United States Department of Health and Human Services. The Administration on Children, Youth, and Family manages the Children's Bureau and the Family and Youth Services Bureau. Before joining the Biden administration via confirmation by the United States Senate in December 2022, Gadsden was a child welfare director for the State of Oregon's Department of Human Services that oversees child protection, foster care, and adoption services, a position she held since 2019. During her time as director, Oregon launched a major transformation built on trauma-informed, family and community-centered, and culturally responsive programs and services. Prior to joining the Oregon senior management team, Gadsden served as the executive director of the Maryland Department of Human Services Social Services Administration with oversight of child welfare and adult services. She has worked in the field of human services and child welfare for nearly 25 years as a social worker, advocate, therapist, consultant, and administrator. Previously, she was a director with Casey Family Programs, providing technical assistance to child welfare agencies throughout the United States, and served as the National Campaign Director for Adopt Us Kids, a collaboration with the Children's Bureau and the National Ad Council. This major campaign, which she now oversees as Commissioner of the Administration of Children, Youth, and Families, continues to help increase the number of foster and adoptive families across the country. She is a proud mother of 2 adult children. Gadsden holds a degree in psychology from Georgetown University and a master's degree in social work from the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Ms. Gadsden. It's an honor to have you, and I'm going to now turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. It is a pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone. It is good to see you, and I am honored to be here to welcome you, but also just share some of my thoughts and experience with the state passage of Indian Child Welfare Act from my experience in Oregon. So I'm looking forward to the topic and to learn from other states about how their implementation is going with state level ICWA, and also what are some of the experiences that we can draw from as we continue to do this work across the country. Before I begin, I would like to extend my gratitude to our moderator, Sheldon Spotted Elk from Casey Family Programs, and Christina Andrews, who you just heard from, and her colleagues at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and the team at ACF for organizing this event. And to our panelists, Barbara Atwater, Professor of Law Emerita at University of Arizona, who apparently is the law professor for many, many people, Representative Lloyd Larson from the state of Wyoming, and Dilma Ives, Director of Tribal Relations for Washington State, DCYF, and Christina Andrews, who is sitting in on behalf of Donalyn Saraceno, Director of the Tribal Affairs in New Mexico's Department of Children, Youth, and Families. Thank you for sharing your time and your expertise. This topic and the importance of Indian child welfare is something that I take very personally. It is a priority here for me in my role as commissioner, but it's been a priority for me in my work previously in the state of Oregon, and then as a social worker throughout my career. And it really centers on the ability for families and communities to have self-determination and to maintain connection between children, families, tribes, and acknowledging the impact that the child welfare system has had on tribal communities throughout history, and the need to really rectify that and change the practice and make sure that we're helping children and families to be together when possible. And if that's not possible, making sure that we maintain the tribal cultural connections and culture for children in the child welfare system. Under President Biden's leadership, This administration is committed to upholding our government-to-government relationship with tribal nations, and that's important to remember in this conversation. As we work to honor this commitment, we recognize that the threat to ICWA is looming, and tribal leaders have voiced that protecting tribal children is an absolute priority. Although the Administration for Children and Families, ACF, is not involved in litigation, the Department of Justice, in collaboration with the Department of Interior, currently holds that responsibility. This administration, the Biden-Harris administration's unwavering stance is that we are fighting to defend the Indian Child Welfare Act. And I want to make that really, really clear. For ACF, we've been working really closely with the Department of Interior, with community members, and which community members say is unprecedented, the level of coordination and collaboration happening. And we're working to improve our services with the aim of reducing disparities and disproportionate impacts. Our ultimate goal is to prevent families from ever needing to be involved with child welfare. We strive to achieve this by creating more partnerships, increasing our knowledge, sharing solutions, and providing preventive support and funding. At ACF, that begins with investing in early education and home visiting programs through to child welfare, which we oversee nationwide. When a child does enter the child welfare system, we do all we can to support their connection with their family, culture, and community. We also aim to facilitate collaboration between states and tribes, creating opportunities for meaningful engagement. We believe that a strengthened partnership between state and tribal governments will foster greater respect for ICWA, better child welfare outcomes, and stronger relationships overall. And I've had a chance to meet many people in the last couple of months as we're doing some of our regional convenings to have these state tribal conversations. To further support this work, I'm incredibly excited to announce that the Notice of Funding Opportunity for State Tribal Partnerships to Implement Best Practices in Indian Child Welfare was published just about 2 weeks ago on grants.gov. So if you haven't seen it, make sure that you check it out. And in closing, together, we are committed to protecting the best interests of all tribal children across the country. Our commitment is unwavering, and we stand with you today, tomorrow, and always. I look forward to continuing this work in partnership with you and further deepening our commitment to support Native families, preserving culture, language, and the way of life for future generations. Thank you for joining this conversation today and for your commitment to children and families. And I'll turn it over now to Sheldon to lead our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. It's so good to see you always. So appreciate those great words, and impressive to hear the support that ACF has given to ICWA and fighting to uphold for family integrity for Indigenous families. So thank you so much for your work. Glad to be here. It's a good day. I'm Northern Cheyenne. My name is Sheldon Spotted Elk. I'm zooming in from Denver, Colorado. My ancestral lands, the Northern Cheyenne ancestral lands here in Denver. We have a great panel for you. This is the second webinar on ICWA that I've been able to be a part of. So I'm really fortunate for that. I'm going to do a little bit of a framing for what we're going to talk about today. We're going to introduce our panelists. We're going to do a deep dive on state ICWAs. And so we're going to make it really interesting. We're going to make it engaging, and we'll make sure that you have contact information if you want to follow up with any of the panelists. We have 341 people on this call, which is really impressive and shows just the commitment and the interest when it comes to state ICWAs. If you do want to, we intentionally kept the chat and the Q&A open. And so if there's a question that you might have that you want us to address, or you want to target to one of the panelists, please put it in the Q&A. Or if you want to say, hey, I'll give a shout out to where you're calling in from in the chat, please do that in the chat. We want to know where you're coming in from and who you are. So please use the chat. And of course, it's open for you guys to talk in the chat with one another. So Good to see you guys. So what I want to do is give you just a little bit of a framing on state ICWAs. And so a few years ago, the National Conference of State Legislatures drafted a paper, and they talked about what comprehensive state ICWAs are. And so, and it's where states enact, and we'll talk a little bit more about this and from our panelists, but states will enact comprehensive state legislation that supports the federal ICWA. Of course, the federal ICWA is the minimum guidelines. And so you could only go up from what the federal law says. And so providing more supports for Indigenous families, children, and tribes. And so before this legislative session started in 2023, there was 10 state comprehensive ICWAs throughout the country. The registration link that you registered for this webinar had kind of a fuzzy map in there, but it showed you those 10 states. There's one state that was passed, and we're going to hear from Wyoming here. They passed a state ICWA in this legislative session, but overall there was 8 states that introduced either comprehensive language or amended their current ICWA. And so Wyoming, of course, passed. Montana is still pending. North Dakota is still pending. And then Colorado, my state where I'm at right now, there's a bill still pending as well. So we'll be keeping our eyes on those 3 states and see if they enact a state ICWA. The other thing, and the reason we are here, of course, and Commissioner Jones-Gaston talked a little bit about it, about Brackeen. Of course, we're waiting for a decision from the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's there's some challenges against the federal ICWA, constitutional challenges. We're going to talk a little bit about that, but generally the 4 challenges that were before the Supreme Court were equal protections, non-delegation of congressional authority, 10th Amendment charges, states' rights, and the Indian Commerce Clause. And so maybe I don't mean to teach a law class right here, but if you pass a state ICWA, essentially 3 of the 4 of those things will be addressed. And so we're going to talk a little bit about those protections and what it looks like on the ground even. And so that's my framing today. We will be keeping our eyes open on the Q&A, but I really want to open up with our panelists introducing themselves. I don't think I'd do them justice, but when they introduce themselves, I want you guys to also answer a question we'll start off with the questions even. I want you to answer the question of who in your life, mentor, relative, parent, that inspired you to do this work. How'd you end up doing this work for Indian families? And who was the mentor or relative or person in your life that really helped support that? So I'll give you an opportunity to give a shout out to somebody right now. So we'll start with Professor Barbara Atwood, if you could do an introduction.
Thank you, Sheldon. And thank you for the whole organization of this webinar. I'm really, really happy to be a part of it. I am a professor emerita at the University of Arizona School of Law, the Rogers College of Law. And over the years, I have worked in areas, both in my teaching and my writing, connected to Native children, Native child welfare, and the Indian Child Welfare Act in particular. At the state level and the local level, I've been involved in developing the Pima County ICWA Court, which is one of the leading ICWA courts, in my opinion, in the country. And I'm also a member of the subcommittee on ICWA of the Tribal State and Federal Court Forum here in Arizona. I'm also a commissioner with the Uniform Law Commission, and that will become relevant later because of its role in perhaps promoting the enactment of state ICWA laws around the country. In terms of answering Sheldon's question, I had to think carefully about it, but one person who was quite significant in my life was a woman whom I represented as a lawyer 30 years ago. Her name was Carol Redcherries, Judge Carol Redcherries, and she's no longer living, but she was a tribal court judge in the Northern Cheyenne tribe. And she came to Arizona with a tribal court judgment that recognized her right to have custody of her granddaughter because her daughter tragically had passed away 6 months after the birth of the infant. And the infant was in the physical custody of her birth father at this point here in Arizona. And it was a case that had difficult emotional resonance for everyone, but my role was to help her enforce that judgment here in state court. And it is one of the first reported cases. We lost at the trial level, but went up on appeal and prevailed, where Arizona gave full recognition to a tribal court judgment from the Northern Cheyenne Tribal Court. She was not the judge in that proceeding. She was just the grandmother. And she really helped me understand the unique value of extended family, and particularly grandparents in the lives of children of that tribe and of many tribes, and also the difficulty in getting recognition of tribal court judgments that protect those links, those ties. So she's been kind of a part of my life ever since. Anyway, that's the person I would mention.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you so much. Representative Lloyd Larson, would you be willing to introduce yourself and tell us somebody who's inspired you?
Thank you, Sheldon. And I too am really honored to be asked or invited to participate in this conversation today. This conversation in Wyoming really does take on some relevance as we contemplate what the Supreme Court's going to do, and as we try to further define what our state ICWA law is going to be. I've been in the legislature now for 11 years, and in all 11 of those years until this year, I've served as a member of our select committee on tribal relations, and for most of those years was the co-chairman on the House side of that. During that time, we really worked hard to redefine the relationship between state government and tribal governments, rather than the state being big brother, working more as a government to government entity, and think that we've really made great progress in that. Our current governor, Mark Gordon, has really reached out and worked very closely with the two tribes here in Wyoming, and we're really pleased with that. I live in Lander, Wyoming, which is right on the border of the Wind River Reservation. And so over my 40 plus years of living in this community, I've worked a lot with both tribes and members of those tribes, and have many good friends from those two tribal nations. When I contemplate the person that influenced me, I'm a simple man, and I look back and I recall growing up in southeastern Utah, and in sixth grade, we had a Ute family from Fort Duchesne move into our community in Monticello, and there's a boy that was my age, and he's walking home from school, and he walks past my house, and I see him bend down. He picks up a rock and throws it at me. So I, in turn, being the logical thing to do, picked up a rock and threw it back. And the ensuing rock fight lasted about 30 minutes. And from that point on, the two of us were pretty much joined at the hip until we graduated high school in 1975. We had a lot of conversations about life, and upon being elected and being part of tribal relations, I hold that relationship very close to my heart, and think that our call is to do right by all people. And his influence on me has been significant over the years.
Oh, thank you. I won't ask who won the rock fight. So thank you.
Well, no, I think he did, because I had to go in the house and steal a bag of cookies, which we devoured on the front lawn.
That's great. Thank you. We'll go to Cynthia Aragon. It's good to have you, and you're replacing Donna Lynn, who had a personal issue that came up, and so happy that you're joining us. So could you please introduce yourself and tell us who you work for and somebody that's inspired you to do this work?
Thank you, Sheldon. It's quite an honor to be here. My name is Cindy Aragon. I'm with the Office of General Counsel, Assistant General Counsel with CYFD, Children, Youth and Families Department, which is the child care, foster care, and child welfare agency within the state of New Mexico. I'm also a member of the Navajo Nation and Chenjikin Inshla, Nakai Bashachin, Chiche, Tachitni, Dinale, Nakai. And that's a traditional way of introducing ourselves. And I think it's really important to do that because when we introduce ourselves with the 4 clans, our parents' clans and our grandparents, paternal and paternal. So we are tied to family beyond our own. And it's like extensive, and that's really, really important to me. That's why I wanted to introduce myself in that way. What's inspired me the most in regards to doing this type of work is my mother and my grandmother. My mom was a child who was taken from the reservation back in the 1940s and sent to boarding school. And because she didn't speak English, was not born in a hospital, did not have a birth certificate. They guessed her age, thinking maybe she was 8, 9. And she was put on a bus and went to Riverside, California from the Navajo Nation and spent the last 3 years away from home because she didn't speak English and she had never been to school. And her experience in regards to what happened to her there and reconnecting with her culture and coming back and the importance of family, and telling me that at one point that she saw a busload of little kids that just arrived and they were lined up. And as they lined up, they were giving them their names, their English names, and they were giving them their religion, Christian religion, Protestant, Catholic, and Mormon, and that they were supposed to go by their names and not their traditional names, cut their hair. And when she saw that busload of kids arrive, she saw her little brother standing in line, and they just looked at each other, they recognized each other, and they didn't see a word. And then she just says, she just remembers tears rolling down her eyes and tears rolling down his eyes. And that inspires me to do this work because of the importance of family, the importance of community, the importance of being connected to a tribe and the tribal culture. And that's what I take from this, and that's why I do this work.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you for sharing such a beautiful personal story. You're actually one of the people that inspired me to do this work. And so you were my clinical law professor. And so you've seen me shaking in my boots at council's table. So I'm glad that you joined us. Thank you so much. Last, Talina, could you introduce yourself and tell us what you do and who's inspired you?
Aitzwaji Gade, Kwewatana Kwisna, Hamusin Sna, Nish Nuket Nuxglayam. Good day, everyone. I carry the ancestral name of Hahamu. I am an enrolled member of the Port Gamble S'Klallam tribe, and I am the Director of Tribal Relations for the Washington State Department of Children, Youth, and Families. I appreciate this question as it helps me to reflect on the rich upbringing that I had. So for the first handful and most critical years of my upbringing, I was raised in a 4-generation home on my tribe's reservation. So while at the time my parents, struggled with poverty, we benefited with richness from the love of my grandmother and my great-grandmother. So through their examples, I've been able to learn the values of living with kin and the importance of kin. These protective factors have helped me as well as I am a single mother of 4 kids. I've raised my 4 children who were at the time all really young. At one time they were 2, 4, 6, and 8 years old, just really young. And you wouldn't believe the looks that I would get when I would go to the grocery store, like I have to shop, I have to feed my kids, and I'm a single mom, but oh my goodness, the looks I would get. So I feel like I lived in fear for years that my kids could also be taken away from me, because that is what I witnessed in my own tribal community. And so I have a background in education and prevention services, early childhood education. And it's definitely the love of family and community from my grandmother's teachings that calls me to this work, to be able to help make sure that our children can benefit from that same nurturing and support to their tribal communities in protecting them and upholding them in their identity. And as well, it's an honor to be here with everybody today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Talina. Thank you for sharing such a beautiful story that's grounded in culture and connection. And so the first question and thank you all. And as you all see, our attendees are giving shout outs in the chat there. And then Heather actually from North Dakota did mention that North Dakota did pass their state ICWA. So now we have 12 state ICWAs. And so snap your fingers. Good news with that. The first question that I want to ask you guys, all you movers and shakers and policymakers that are on this panel here, I want to talk to you about just general reflections of the Brackeen case. I know the amicus outreach on this Brackeen case was really incredible. 23 states, the way that I counted, and the District of Columbia. And then more impressive to me was 497 tribes signed an amicus brief drafted by NARF. I'll read you one of the quotes, and so I want some of your general reflections on it, but this quote was really powerful to me. The amicus brief, the tribal amicus brief, ends with this paragraph that ICWA remains one of the most important pieces of federal legislation ever enacted. It has provided immense and lasting benefit to the Amici tribes and tribal organizations and their collective goals for furthering tribal sovereignty in the best interests of Indian children. The court should uphold ICWA as an appropriate exercise of Congress's Indian Affairs power. Really kind of getting to the heart of it. Of course, ICWA has been called the gold standard by national organizations. We're going to learn about New Mexico's platinum standard here in a little bit too, but general reflections about the Brackeen case. And I know some of you guys actually traveled out to the US Supreme Court. So opened up for whoever wants to go first.
Sheldon, I did not attend the arguments, but I listened to them with a group of students here at the University of Arizona Law School. And I'll just give my quick thoughts about the case. It, of course, triggered a lot of interest among tribes around the nation because some fundamental principles of federal Indian law seem to be at risk. One, as Sheldon mentioned, was whether Congress has the power under the Commerce Clause to even enact ICWA. And that I think that will fail, that argument. I think Congress does have that power, is what I mean to say. That I don't think that's a winning argument, but it's one that will get the support of at least probably a couple of members of the United States Supreme Court. Justice Thomas has already made it clear that he buys that argument, but there's such a history of plenary power on the part of the federal government. And it would be ironic if the federal government had exercised power to remove Indian children from their homes and families and now lack the power to try to remedy that atrocity through the 1978 Indian Child Welfare Act. But what has people really concerned, I think, is the equal protection challenges that are being made. The argument is that benefiting children who are tribal members or eligible for tribal membership and the biological child of a tribal member, that's the definition of Indian child, that fades over into race discrimination as opposed to classification based on political membership in a tribe. That argument, I think, will also fail as to that particular portion of ICWA. I think there's a sufficient tie to tribal membership in the definition to get around an allegation that it's racial in nature. But there are maybe some parts of ICWA, what we call the third tier preferences that give priority, for example, to the placement in adoption of an Indian child with another Indian family not connected to the child's tribe, that seem to concern a number of the justices during oral arguments. It may be that particular piece of ICWA gets invalidated. It's unclear to me, of course, or anybody else what this court's going to do, but that seemed to be the most vulnerable aspect. And if that were the case, that would still leave room, plenty of room. That preference is actually rarely used in the actual practice of ICWA at the ground level. The other challenge was the notion that the federal government had encroached on state authority, that had commanded or commandeered states to do things that in violation of a doctrine that's been developed in the last generation from the US Supreme Court. And that too, there may be some concern on the Supreme Court level that ICWA tells state agencies what to do through the active efforts requirement, for example, that may be vulnerable. If that is the case, no matter what the court does, if it does it on the question of, on the basis of unlawful, unconstitutional commandeering by the federal government, that definitely leaves a path for states to step in. Because states themselves can say, we in fact endorse these policies and we're going to continue them as a matter of state law, which is why state legislation is so important, more important than ever at this point.
Thank you, Barbara. Helena, I know you were out there. I'll go right directly to you. Any reflections on bracketing in general?
Yeah, sure. I'll share that on November 9th, I believe it was, when the Supreme Court hearings were taking place. I know NCJFCJ and others hosted a gathering right outside the steps. And so it was an honor to be there with our state agency secretary, Department of Children, Youth and Families, Ross Hunter, as well as Healthcare Authority's secretary, another tribal state liaison, and tribal leaders from Washington State. So from the perspective that I have in thinking about being there together, I do feel that time there was bonding and healing in a way for us to be able to reinforce and show our support. There was an overwhelming amount of, emotion and ceremony, songs, prayers that were shared on that day, and those still continue today as we, have this battle that we're working against. One of the things that I'll always remember from that day is at the center of the circle, there were some baby moccasins that were laid there for us to remember that this is for our children, for the protection of them. And so just a beautiful visualization and a way for us to remember why we're doing this work, as well as on that theme of the way that we coordinate and collaborate. I'm also really hopeful and thankful that in Washington, we did sign on to that amicus, as well as 100% of the tribes in Washington did sign on to that amicus. So I feel comfort in knowing that I'm in a place of like-minded people who are in this battle together, as well as everyone across the country. So that's what I would share about that and the reflections that I have too. It's important for us to know from our leadership where they stand on this. We invited our secretary to join us for the numerous tribal meetings we've had, also working with the governor's office to bring our governor in to also show the support that Washington state government and leadership has in making sure that no matter what happens, we will sort through this together, and that we'll continue to honor tribal sovereignty. And regardless of what happens, we're always going to follow our government to government agreements and recognize tribes as the federally recognized tribes and tribes as sovereign nations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for describing what that was like being outside the Supreme Court. Cynthia or Lloyd, any reflections just in general on bracketing before we jump into state ICWA conversation?
Sheldon, I think it's important that I point out in Wyoming is our tie legislatively really to the tribes and their needs is through this select committee on tribal relations. And the other chairman that has served with me for a number of years is a state senator who practices law in Cheyenne and is a member of the Navajo Nation by the name of Afi Ellis, and is just brilliant. And we are so lucky to have her. And so she stays abreast of all of this stuff and kind of helps us focus where strategically it has been important. And so we've been focusing on Brackeen for a number of years, just curious how this goes. We didn't think it would ever get to the Supreme Court. We thought, in our armchair judicial review of stuff, we just didn't think it would ever happen. And Wyoming has just always complied with the federal regulation. And so as Brackeen has come forward, our agencies, our Department of Family Services particularly, is voiced concern that the race discrimination component of that versus sovereignty that Barbara talked about really creates a problem if the Supreme Court does anything. And then the commandeering component of that she brings up really underlined for us the need to move forward on establishing something statewide in absence of that something happens federally. And so Brackeen has forced us to come out of our comfort zone, which was, well, we'll just do what the federal act does. And then as we look at doing the state thing, really give a thoughtful exercise in making sure, or trying to make sure that we do right by the people it's intended to protect.
Thank you. Thank you for giving us that framing. Cynthia, any general reflections before we jump in?
Just general reflections was I really was impressed with the unity of the tribal sovereignty. It was definitely very unified and advocates for our Indian children and our culture and traditions. I did hear a portion of the arguments. I was impressed with the questions that the Supreme Court justices were asking. They would seem to be very thorough in covering every detail, every nuance. But I didn't hear all of it, but I just was glad that we had a united force in states as well as tribal communities that came together.
That was one of the most impressive things for me as well. So thank you for sharing that. We'll jump right in. And so let's act like I don't know anything about ICWA. What is a state ICWA? Tell me what it is and how it functions. And so tell me what that is. And so if I'm the naive listener and don't know very much about how this works, tell me what it is and why they're important. We'll go with you, Barbara.
Okay. Happy to talk about that. What we mean are our efforts at the state level to either through legislation or through court rule, which is what has happened in Arizona, for example, put into state law both the mandates of the Federal Indian Child Welfare Act, but also often what states have done is to accommodate that federal mandate into the sort of unique state procedural language that may be different from the sort of broad-based language of ICWA, and to fill in gaps where ICWA is not particularly detailed with respect to, for example, the meanings of good cause under the transfer provision or in the placement preferences. So we're really talking about state statutory provisions that implement ICWA at the state level, sometimes go further than ICWA. And we've seen increased interest in this for obvious reasons now with the rise of the Brackeen litigation. So it's just as Representative Larson was saying, it is scaring people, frankly, that if the federal mandate disappears for one reason or another under the U.S. Supreme Court's decision, that there would be nothing left, and that the states definitely have to step in.
Thank you, Barbara. And there's actually a question in there from Michelle in the Q&A for you, actually, and it's about the dynamics of California with a lot of out-of-state tribes that live within California. But do you have any recommendations on ways to reframe that third placement preference? Because they use it frequently in California, but is there a way to reframe that to withstand an equal protections challenge?
Well, one thing that I've noticed in some of the state ICWA legislation is instead of just leaving the third preference in the ICWA language, which says speaking only at this point of adoptive preferences. Other Indian families is what the ICWA preference is. And that triggered a bunch of questions from various justices during the Brackeen arguments about, well, how does that connect the child to the child's tribe? Isn't that the whole goal of ICWA? What some states have done is to say other Indian families approved of by the child's tribe, or endorsed by the child's tribe. In other words, linking that preference category to the child's own tribal affiliation. And I think that's a pretty straightforward way that would seem, at least in my mind, to meet the arguably to meet the objections that were expressed at the Supreme Court level.
Thank you. Anybody else? Why is the state ICWA important? What is the state ICWA and why are they important? Lloyd, please.
That is the question, Sheldon, in Wyoming right now. Okay, we're trying to figure that out, and it's really important because, you look at this panel for people participating, they look at this panel. The real deficiency is this old gray-haired fat guy talking now that he's just elected by the people. And this group of our citizens of the state are left to depend on him and his colleagues to protect their best interest, right? And so around the country, states who are trying to figure this all out are really relying on just good old boys and gals, and they're all with the best intent trying to figure this out. So I think it really requires some due diligence and to reaching out to experts and that understand the implications of what not having a state ICWA would do. In Wyoming, if you're not from around Fremont County, where I live, or the Wind River Reservation, and you start visiting with my colleagues in the legislature and you start talking about tribal issues and in conflicts between sovereignties and in federal and state law, there's just this deer in the headlight look, so I think, and I don't think that's uncommon in most states where there's a minority of the legislators that really have, and at best maybe remedial unless you have FELs, but for the rest of us, we don't have this comprehensive understanding of this. And so our tribal families and our tribal governments have got to feel like they're kind of walking on some squishy ground right now. Will these guys step up to the plate and do right by us, or are they just and so we look to see what other countries have done. We've got some slides that have been prepared that I look at New Mexico, and our Department of Family Service is always telling me about what Washington State does. If you guys would just do what Washington State does. But so we're kind of copycats, we look and try to see what others are doing. And, I'm confident that we need to exercise a little caution and not just jump into something and then say, oh crap, we didn't do that right. And take a measured approach and look at what others have done, best practices, because as you mentioned earlier, there's this baseline standard in that the state ICWAs are intended to exceed those, right? Be equal to or exceed. But we've found in our research that that's not always been the case, that some of those state laws have been adopted that compromise the intent of ICWA, and we need to make sure that we don't accidentally step in that pothole and do that. So when you ask what is a state ICWA, we're working to that direction, but I don't know that we have that answer yet.
Thank you, Representative Larson. I appreciate the framing as well, and just the education with your colleagues and getting them up to speed what tribal sovereignty is. And that's really important for us to understand as citizens. So thank you. Talina,
Sure, yeah, and thank you, Representative Larson. I think that, why reinvent the wheel? And it's great to hear that there's examples that Washington State could provide. Washington State Indian Child Welfare was enacted in 2011, and some of the differences that what we call WICWA, so sorry, I'm trying to avoid using any of the acronyms, but here are Washington State ICWA, does have some additional protections that ICWA does not, and that includes definition of the best interest of the child. And then prior to the BIA regulations in 2016, we had already defined active efforts. We did see later that the BIA guidelines did include that. We also require an assessment of active efforts at each hearing, and so that's unique. One of the other things that I think is unique about WICWA, our state ICWA, is that we require an ICWA case review to monitor the agency's compliance. And so that is something that we've found to be helpful in being able to look at areas locally or statewide that we can provide additional technical assistance with. I'd also share really quick too, when thinking about the importance of our state ICWA, we've really, stood on the shoulders of some great tribal leaders here in Washington State. And prior to the passage of ICWA in the early 70s, we did have and still have today what we call the Local Indian Child Welfare Act Advisory Committee, sorry. And this advisory committee has served in the advisory capacity, which makes the recommendations for appropriate case plans and services for Indian children when the tribe has not been identified, or if the tribe is not involved or available. So presently we have our local Indian child welfare advisory committees very active in every region throughout the state, and they're a valuable service to our child welfare staff and for Indian families. And so I just wanted to share a bit of history of how I think our state ICWA and the federal legislation has benefited from the strong leadership of tribes in Washington State and across the country as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I know you've talked before about how the state law has even had impact on Washington State's disproportionality of Indian children in foster care, even your state law has. Is that correct? Or
yeah, we were looking at prior to 2011, the downward trend that we had seen after the passage of our Washington State Indian Child Welfare Act. So if I had any slide to share today, I would just kind of have a slide that would share that I think it helps to bring focus, attention, and energy into making sure that we're following the protections of the law. While we still have high rates of disproportionality, we have a lot of work to do still here in Washington, but we've definitely seen an improvement because of the passage of the Washington State Indian Child Welfare Act.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Cindy, what is a state ICWA? Why is it important? I know you're sitting in an important chair there in New Mexico. So
yes, and I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that there was definitely some concern about how the state agency was addressing ICWA and the mandates of federal law. And so when Brad Keene came about, or the issues of Brad Keene, then to jump on the opportunity of let's provide language that clarifies those federal mandates that we feel are good and that we feel that benefit our children and our tribal communities. But let's surpass that language and strengthen it to make it unique to us as the tribal communities. And the tribes were very, very, they led the development and of our state ICWA. It wasn't the state agencies drafting or professionals that publish and write that aren't in the community. It was a group of tribal leadership, tribal ICWA workers through the New Mexico TIC And I'll go into that more on during my specific area that took the lead and said, we're going to address this. And they got together, developed work groups, involved the tribes, and started drafting.
Wow. I love that. It's coming from Indigenous values. It's coming from Indigenous connectedness values, that children need to be connected. And so that's a beautiful story. I thank you for sharing that. We'll go to Talina. We'll come back to you, Talina. And I saw there's a couple of questions in the chat here. And so I'm going to hopefully combine some of those questions. But number one, I've heard that you guys are doing some really amazing policy work right now, and partnership, kind of on the back of what Cindy was talking about, how tribes need to lead on this. So when you sit on the state side of things, and how do you work in partnership with tribes to make sure that that's happening? There's a question in there about if there's any information that you have on the local. I only know it by the acronym, the LICWACs. So is there any information that you have on that? And you maybe tell us a little bit more about that. And then what are you guys doing as far as training goes? And how do you access training if that was something that was needed in Washington State? So we'll go to you, Talina.
Great. Yeah, I will work on trying to put something in the chat to help give some more online resources for the local Indian Child Welfare Advisory Committee. It's also in rule and code in Washington State. So I think there were a few questions there. So sorry if I miss any. I will share that some of the great work that's happening right now in Washington in response to a few Supreme Court opinions that have come out of Washington State have really helped to strengthen, I believe, our government to government relationships. And our relationships with tribes has become stronger because the changes that we're making to our policies and procedures to reflect the needed compliance is something we could not do without the expertise of tribes. And so we've formed a tribal state work group that has, for almost the last 2 years, worked really closely with a delegate from a tribe from each region in Washington State. We have 29 federally recognized tribes in Washington State and 6 regions. So we've worked closely with them, and they consist of tribal attorneys, tribal leaders, social service directors. I think we have some of them on here today, and tribal prosecutors, as well as our state's AGs and subject matter experts, a variety of staff and voices from the field that carry out this work that can help us to make those needed changes. And so the kind of the theme that I'm hearing and that I really feel is helpful is that we wouldn't have been able to do any of this work without the support and coordination and consultation with the tribes. We're getting ready right now to go through our roundtable process in reviewing these updated policies and procedures. And then we'll be moving to a formal consultation coming up in June. The policies and procedures that we've worked on, some people call it our ICWA manual. It guides social work practice in Washington State. And we have 26 chapters that we have developed, including some brand new ones that address active efforts, reason to know. And we also have what I think is unique, our impasse procedures as well. So there's so much that I can say about this work. We're also thankful for the partnership that we've received from outside consultants, and then Casey family as well, who has supported and provided, legal experts to assist us with making these policies and procedures the very best that they can be. So it's definitely a dynamic, moving piece of policy and procedure that we're very proud of, and it has helped to strengthen our relationships. I think that was part of your question. Sorry, am I missing another one?
I will follow up actually on that, because I know, like, just in my experience, that relationships are so key to making sure that the on the ground work really is in the right way for Indian families and children. So how do you maintain those relationships and make sure that those relationships are working relationships with the tribes, and making sure that those partnerships are what they need to be in order to get where you need to be? So.
Yeah, thank you. We have so many different ways that we want to ensure that those relationships are going well. And I think part of it is through the Office of Tribal Relations. We have ICWA consultants in each region, and they work closely with the tribes to have a 1003 plan, which our 1003 is our government to government policy that we have for the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. We're also fortunate to have RCW, our state law that supports government to government relationships and clearly defines what that should look like. So those are just a few of the examples of how we do that. We have monthly ICW subcommittee, as well as a few other advisory committees that we work closely with within our agency to ensure that any policies, procedures, work that we're doing in Washington, we're doing this in coordination and consultation with tribes.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. And if there's any other questions that you want to add to other people, please jump in at any point. All of you, actually, if there's something that you're like, hey, I want to answer a question, I want to tag on to what Talina just said, please feel free to jump in at any time. We'll go to you, Cynthia. And I know you're talking a little bit about, oh, and I wanted to say this before I jumped in. There is a general resource. So if you Google state ICWAs, and Turtle Talk. So Turtle Talk's an Indian law blog maintained by Matthew Fletcher and Kate Fort. Kate Fort keeps a track of all the state ICWAs. And so if you want to say, where's all these state ICWAs, where's the resources to it? If you just Google Turtle Talk state ICWAs, it'll pull up. But going to you, Cindy. So you tell us a little bit about how the Indian Child Welfare Act, or the Indian Family Protection Act in New Mexico was passed, and the genesis. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and the partnerships that have really helped effectuate not only the black letter law, but also the spirit of that law, and really to effectuate, I know it's been called the Platinum Standard. So maybe tell us a little bit more about that and why it is the Platinum Standard.
So Judge, former Secretary Barbara V. Hill, was a former Supreme Court Justice here in the state of New Mexico, has said that our New Mexico law, we have ICWA as a gold standard, but New Mexico is a platinum standard. And so basically, we've enhanced and looked at language that ICWA, federal ICWA and the BIA regs had, and looked at surpassing that language and creating the extra protections. From the viewpoint that if Brackeen came in and federal ICWA was to be totally just demolished and wiped off the books, how would we as an agency address the important policy provisions of preserving culture and family and community involvement for our children who are in state custody? And some of that came from the development in 2015 with the establishment of what an organization that was called the New Mexico Tribal Indian Child Welfare Consortium. And in the acronym, we call it New Mexico TIC. And Donalyn Saraceno, who was scheduled to present today, but had a family, a death in the family from an elder in her family. So she wasn't here, but she sends her regards. She was the founder in starting that. And what that was a group of consortium of tribal Indian child welfare social workers from the 23 tribes and pueblos here in New Mexico, who worked collaboratively to improve and strengthen Indian child practices, welfare practices in New Mexico. And these are individuals who are experts because they're the ones who are dealing with the issues from a tribal standpoint in state courts. How are the state courts handling this? How are they being addressed on a case-by-case basis, not only in the metropolitan court areas, but statewide? What are the issues? What are the concerns? So that group meets regularly. They meet on a monthly basis and they talk about issues and concerns and challenges that affect that interfere with the issues that promote tribal children in state custody to have contact with their tribal communities and families. So part of the work came from the testimonials and the stories that resulted from those firsthand experiences that these workers had experienced in attending court proceedings and dealing with the children, youth, and family as a child welfare agency. So those testimonials led to possible changes in the law that needed to be done. One of the big ones was notice. Tribes complain that they still don't get notice. They don't have the opportunity to receive notice. So pursuant to the Indian Family Protection Act, which is what we call our state ICWA in New Mexico, is that notice goes out for all child custody proceedings. And that includes investigations. When the reports go in initially, when the call goes in, a notice goes to the tribe saying we've received a call that regarding this child and this child is believed to possibly be a member of your community or your tribe. So it starts there. Then the second notice before filing the petition goes out that we've substantiated that investigation or not substantiated, and the reasons that we're going to and what we're doing to work towards that. The third one is after filing of the petition and what active efforts we have to make to show that we have prevented the removal of the Indian child by working with those families. And what are we doing to do that? So that was a big one, because before with the federal ICWA, notice doesn't go out till after the petition's filed. So that's a big one. Another big one in regards to some of the other issues is having a liaison, having the person or within the agency that they can rely on to be the contact for the agency. And so we codified the development of the Office of Tribal Affairs, of which Donna Lynn is the director. And Donna Lynn comes from background working in child welfare as an ACWA social service worker, ICWA worker, and has extensive experience working with children, and came from the tribal side and then became the director. So now the Office of Tribal Affairs has been codified to make sure that there's compliance with the Indian Family Protection and the mandates of the federal ICWA. So there's in her staff that we have a behavioral health coordinator, we have a tribal behavioral health coordinator, a tribal protective services coordinator, a juvenile justice coordinator. In addition, we have a ICWA trainer and a quality assurance person. So now she finally has full staff. I'm from the Office of General Counsel, and the Office of General Counsel pretty much represents the organization. We don't do any of the children's court attorney removal, and the proceedings are going about involved more so from the lawsuits perspective and representing the organization and policy legislation. So as part of those efforts, the Office of General Counsel did note that one of the attorneys in that office would be specifically assigned to do tribal work. And so that's what I do. I do specifically tribal work. I work on all the agreements with the tribe, the Title 40 pass-through agreements, any and everything regarding policy and everything that impacts that. So those are two big things. There's a lot of things that came about in regards to it. We changed the definition of membership of a child. We took out the fact that they don't have to be a biological child of a member. They just have to be eligible for membership. And that membership is determined by the tribe. And that membership is based on custom and can also be based on custom and tradition. Because what was happening is that social workers or guardian ad litems or respondents attorneys would look up and say, well, this kid's mom is half Navajo. And so that means this kid would be in possibly a quarter. They meet the blood quantum, and therefore they automatically tell the judges that, hey, this kid is eligible for membership with this tribe. And then they would cut it off based on enrollment or either looking it up on the websites within the particular tribe's enrollment. So that move towards membership is that it's up to the tribes to determine who's their member, and it's not based on enrollment. And it's based on it, and the concept of enrollment, as our tribal counterparts have stated, is a federal Indian policy of assimilation. That was what came about as a result of that, and this should membership is based on custom and tradition. It also extending the whole idea of who is considered fictive kin. I know the federal, they use the word fictive kin. Again, fictive kin is foreign. Native communities are like, what's that? So the important thing of noting that it's also based on custom and tradition, and it's based, can include clan members, godparents, which are important to public communities. So there's a lot of different things, the importance of a child that's under 3 months that cannot be placed outside the placement preferences whatsoever. Under no circumstances, that's a really powerful one, because children are so sacred, and at that young age, they're still considered very, very sacred to us as Native people. And so under no circumstances do those children, that child that young, be placed out of it. And we took out the federal requirements. That was number 4 in institution. We don't have that as our placement preferences. We just also indicate that the tribe can state whatever placement preference they want, and that takes precedent over anything else. And then again, the importance of training, because a lot of mandating training for judges, mandating training for respondents, attorneys, guardian ad litems, people that work in the courts, foster parents, so that they can also take into consideration the importance of why this is important. So you don't have kids that go home that have a visit for a cultural event. They're coming back with either a medicine bag or an arrowhead. And then the resource parents saying, what is that? Why are you wearing that? Or opening the medicine bag or looking into it, but also looking at the importance of what we call now cultural humility, and that we that those kinds of things are intrusive, and how this whole implementation of our Indian Family Protection Act is not just it's a systemic wide approach to training judges, training partners in the community, training our tribes, and also looking at and looking at the experts who in their own tribal communities are tribal leaders, our tribal cultural ICWA workers, our tribal social workers, who sometimes kind of like, well, they haven't published anything. Why are they considered an expert?
Could you tell us a little bit more about the cultural compacts provision that's within the New Mexico
Sure.
IFPA? Because I think that's one of the unique things about that law.
And I do have a slide on it, but if I can go ahead and just read from that too. So let me just.
Or you could tell us just a little bit how it functions.
Sure. So the cultural compact came about. And the Pueblo of Nambe, Julie Bird, who's an ICWA worker and a social worker that works for the Pueblo, was instrumental. And she said that I was the loud voice in making sure this piece was in there. And so her work was, and she told the story, and I'm going to repeat it because I think it's really important, that the reason that this was so critical was that she had a native child who was from the Pueblo of Nambe. Had approached her and asked her, I want to see my brothers and sisters. I want to be able to have contact with them. And can you help me find them? So she was approached and was asked to do this. And this look in this child's eyes as he asked her this question. And so when she went back to the tribe and looked for records and looked for information to try to locate this child's siblings, could not be found anywhere. So for her to come back after her extensive search to tell this kid that she couldn't help him, that she couldn't find that, and seeing the tears in her eyes as she said that at a presentation we did this week, she said that was the basis for her coming up with the cultural compacts, and Julie's from the Pueblo of Nambe. So basically the cultural compact pursuant to the Indian Family Protection Act is an agreement. And it's an agreement that documents how an Indian child placed in an adoptive or guardianship home will continue to actively participate in the child's cultural learning and activities, And that agreement is entered into between the adoptive parents or guardians of the Indian child, which the parents or guardians, if they're not members of that child's tribe, and the Indian child's tribe. So, and the mandates of our Indian Family Protection Act look at the importance of how that came about in regards to Indian families, and that it was to ensure that it was fully implemented, that those protections of the Indian Family Protection Act were fully implemented, and all Indian children would have the opportunity to maintain strong connections to their culture.
Right.
So basically, it requires the parties to the adoption to enter into the cultural compact. At the discretion of the Indian tribe, again, it's up to the tribe. And again, and it documents the parties' agreement regarding how the Indian child will continue to actively participate in the Indian child's cultural learning and activities, engagement with family members. And each compact is specific to the child as the child grows and the child articulates and understands and matures, and it becomes part of the court record. And it's enforced by the court and included in the adoption decree. So this is really, really important in looking at those kiddos that get adopted out or placed out of their communities and their tribes, how they have an opportunity to maintain that connection. And so CYFE as a child welfare agency is not involved at all in this. We are involved only to the extent that we are documenting those cultural connections from the beginning, from the case when it comes on. So that's the important part, is that we continue to document and make sure the kid is involved at the beginning all the way through. That it's not just at the adoption and guardianship, that we work with the tribal communities in collaboration, and that they're brought to the table. That was a biggie on this ICWA.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I feel like the values around culture, indigenous cultural connectedness is so important for resiliency. And here we got it in law, and it's codified with remedies connected to it. So that's really great. I'm going to, just in sake of time, I'm going to jump to Representative Larson. I understand 2 bills were passed in the Wyoming State Legislative House this year. So one bill was bringing the federal ICWA into the state language, into the state law rather. But I understand that House Bill 19 is establishing a task force. If you could tell us a little bit about that task force and what you're hoping to achieve with that task force. I know you talked a little bit about it, but if you could tell us a little bit more.
Oh, thank you. So the task force was really the foundational legislation that we had planned on presenting to the legislature this year, as we anticipated some of this action of the Supreme Court. We envisioned that there would be time that if we could establish this task force, which had representation from tribes, from prosecuting attorney and defense attorney and other people, that we could maybe craft or put into place language for a state ICWA statute. As we got closer, actually just shortly before the session, there was concern that in the event that the Supreme Court somehow overturned in Brackeen the federal law, then what would we do during this interim period of time where maybe the federal ICWA is no longer in place and we don't have a state ICWA in place, and how do we meet the needs of that? So Senator Ellis sponsored the bill that I co-sponsored, where we took the federal legislation and we conformed it as best we could to our state statutes and dropped it into place. That's the state ICWA that we currently have in place. Now that came with some hesitation from the legal minds who serving in the state legislature. They don't like to just on short notice take a federal act and drop it into state law, and there's a lot of concerns. We actually passed the legislation on the task force before we passed the implementation of this state ICWA law. They agreed fully. We need to do something, get this figured out, come back to us with legislation. When we said we needed to put this federal legislation into our state statutes as a bridge until we get something more formal and that fits Wyoming to the best, they said, okay, we'll even buy that, but we're going to put a sunset on it. And so our state ICWA law that we adopted will sunset in 2027. So really what my colleagues are saying is task force, kick it in gear. Let's get this done. We support that, but we're not going to let you just drag this on and somehow, because we still have some angst about some of the language in the federal law and as Barbara's brought up that could be corrected. And so it's kind of incentive or that, and the downside of that is if we were just complacent and don't get our job done, that the state ICWA, which is our existing federal law, would expire, and then we would just go under state law on handling Indian children, regardless of their status in life or place in life.
Thank you so much, Representative Larson. I appreciate that insight, what you guys are doing with the task force, and we'll keep our eyes on it. We'll all keep our eyes on it. All 300 of us that are on this call, we'll keep our eyes on it. So thank you.
Well, and we don't know that that's the right approach, but that's the approach we're taking. We just do the best we can.
Awesome. Thank you. We'll go to Professor Atwood, Barbara. And so for all us legal nerds that are on here, I know you've looked at all the state ICWAs. Is there any model language in there that you would have, I don't know, you'd draw attention to? Maybe if there's policymakers or lawmakers that are on this call right now, is there anything that you would really highlight for some of them that are considering a state ICWA? And I also want to hook in another question in this as well. There's a question that was in the chat, and somebody asked, is there any danger if Brackeen goes a certain way that these state ICWAs would topple as well? So is there any danger to that? So question for you.
Okay, thanks, Sheldon. I'll take that first question. I mean, the second question first, which I think if the Supreme Court goes along an equal protection challenge and sustains that to the whole statute or part of the statute, that of course will bind the states, and the states would not be able to come back with state law that would be in violation of whatever the Supreme Court's pronouncement is on equal protection. Other than that, the challenges really go to the scope of federal authority, and I think those are the likely to be the more serious challenges, but they will leave an open avenue for states, in my opinion, to legislate. And as to your first more general question, some of the provisions that I think are worth highlighting have been highlighted already by Cynthia in terms of the New Mexico law. Has some really wonderful, in my opinion, and creative provisions, and particularly the cultural compact idea that New Mexico has legislated. And Talina has identified some of the, I think, very helpful provisions of the Washington law. I wanted to just emphasize Talina's point about working collaboratively with tribal leaders in developing whatever legislation a state comes up with. Here in Arizona, the Tribal State and Federal Court Forum, the subcommittee on ICWA that I've mentioned, is headed by two judges, one from the state side and one from the tribal court side, who have been leaders in ICWA reform for many years. And I think that's why that particular group has been really successful. But I also wanted to mention another thing, and that is going back to when I introduced myself, I said I was a commissioner with the Uniform Law Commission. That's a national group that develops and proposes uniform legislation for states to enact. And due to the efforts of Kate Ford at Michigan State and Addie Smith in Oregon, who's worked in ICWA issues for a long time, the Uniform Law Commission received a proposal from them, and the Uniform Law Commission accepted the proposal and has appointed a study committee to explore the feasibility and desirability of a uniform state ICWA law. and that committee is ongoing right now. I'm a member of it, and there are many people on this call who are observers who have been participants. And the committee's is sort of waiting for Brackeen. It will meet again in July. We will know what Brackeen has given us by July, presumably, and it will, I think, take up the sort of specific question of what could be proposed for state enactment. And I think I'm really glad that the Uniform Law Commission has gotten into this world, because it can have a significant impact around the country. I did want to just mention also that some of the state legislative provisions have filled in areas that have been particularly troublesome and given rise to a lot of appeals in this area. And the active efforts question from, that requirement from ICWA, now that we have the regulations, those regulations have shown up as codified state law in some of these dozen or so state comprehensive legislations. And we've already talked about the definition of Indian child. Several states have lopped off the requirement that that child be a biological child of a member. I think that's a healthy step forward, and maybe could also blunt some of the challenges that ICWA is all about ancestry and not political association. I also wanted to mention, I think Representative Larson talked about, there are a lot of people in state legislatures and in the states who don't really grasp the principles of tribal sovereignty and the history of this area. And the new Minnesota law contains a preamble that is somewhat similar to the federal law in its statement of policies, but it's a very powerful statement of recognition of tribal sovereignty, recognition of the importance of maintaining tribal ties for Native children, and the role that the sort of negative role that states have played in the past. And I think it's a good way for a state to start in its legislation by including language that is both maybe aspirational, but also educational.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Tillian, I see your hands up. We have about 4 minutes left. And so I was going to give everybody a chance to do it, but do you have a comment or?
I'll make it really quick. Just another area that I think that we could see additional support in other areas of legislation includes Washington State does have since time immemorial that helps with the understanding of tribal sovereignty. And this is important because we see high rates of disproportionality at intake, and several of those calls end up being unsubstantiated. And when those calls are coming from mandated reporters within the school, we see a high amount of bias that's happening. And I would only hope that through the legislation that we have with the since time immemorial, the requirement that schools need to incorporate tribal sovereignty in their curriculum, that will also help as well. So I just wanted to share that as an additional way for us to think outside of the box. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And everybody, thank you so much for wrapping up right now. We have 3 minutes left. I want to just appreciate and show appreciation to the panel. And then also everybody that participated in the chat. I see that there's networking happening in there. There's a bunch of resources in there. So I appreciate all you guys could be on the panel. You guys could be on this panel, some of you guys. And so appreciate you guys communicating with one another in the chat. But I'll leave parting shots. Any inspirational words that you could leave us workers that are out there trying to serve Indian families and work for tribes? Is there anything that you would want to leave us with? We have about 2 minutes now. So we'll go with you, Cynthia. Do you want to go first?
Of course, Sheldon, you put me on the spot, right? I just think that it's important that it's not a one-size-fits-all process, and that we need to look at the unique characteristics of each child in each case. And I would say like a piece of art, each piece is different. And that it's not a one size fits all, and that we need to take the time to respect that and honor that.
Thank you. Lloyd, any parting shots?
I would just suggest to those of you who are advising legislature or legislators is to be really, it's really helpful when we have the facts, leave the emotion out of it, but just really help us to understand the details and ideas behind that. Critical for us to have success is the experts' unadulterated understanding of what's going on. It's critical for us.
Thank you. That's good advice. Barbara.
Well, I actually would mention one specific thing that building on Talina's mention of it, the helpfulness of having a state ICWA guide, a sort of manual that is connected to the state's own procedural laws, but also it can be a compilation of state decisions, court decisions on the question. And we have such a guide that we've developed in Arizona. We were first inspired by Michigan, which has such a guide. And it is very helpful, especially for non-lawyers, for some case workers, state and tribal side, judges, lawyers in general. It is a very helpful resource, and it is also something that can be the collaborative effort of tribal leaders and state leaders at the same time.
Thank you. Professor Atwood, would you mind sharing your email address if people want to get a hold of you and get in contact with you?
Totally happy to do that. Should I just do it in chat?
Sure, that would be a great place to do it. And Talina, final shot.
Thank you. Just Hotningson, thank you. Raising my hands to each and every one of you in our federal partners with ACF, Casey and Casey Family, National Council for Juvenile Court Judges, tribal leaders that are here, our tribal partners. I really see this as something that we are going to be able to come together in our relationship building to make things better and stronger for Indian children and families. Hotningson.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate you guys on the panel, and thank you, everybody, for organizing this. Hopefully there's a webinar 3, and hopefully I'm fortunate enough to get to host it as well. So if I do, we'll see you then. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Sheldon. Great job moderating.
Thank you.